I'm recording because I turned it off when we started. Now I will screen share. You'd think that doing this regularly, we would all have it down pat. But
Oh, it's all good.
everything's still like, oops. And there's always, no matter how many Zoom meetings people are on, there's always the person who starts talking, and then everyone has to say, wait, you're muted. So at least we don't have that today. Okay, so talking about education in Judaism, and education is a really interesting topic. I'm gonna start with two stories, true stories. One is years and years and years ago, I was visiting with cousins in Chicago, and my cousin Darren was house hunting. She was not yet expecting her first child. So she and her husband were moving from their little condo into a house with hopes for building their family. And while I was there, my aunt and uncle were also there, and my aunt and my cousin and I did a whole bunch of house hunting. We went to a lot of houses, we did a lot of open houses, and one of the really interesting things we noticed was in the Jewish houses, the number of books that existed. Now, there may have been books in the other houses as well, but they were not, there didn't seem to be as many, nor did they seem to be as predominantly displayed as they were in the Jewish homes. And that, obviously this is a generality. It doesn't hold for every Jewish home, but if you were to walk into my house, you would find that there are books in pretty much every single room. And even when we lived in our last house, which we were renting, even in the guest bathroom, there was a little thing of a little basket with paperbacks stuck on a shelf. So even in there were books. And that means that we have furniture that's built for bookcases. So I'm sitting on my porch, but behind me, you see our living room and our dining room both have books. Our foyer has a bookcase in it. Our kitchen has some cookbooks. Every bedroom has a bookcase. Our basement has bookcases. Our den has bookcases. And even years ago, I said, we need to put things in the basement. We only had bookcases basically on all the walls and the ping pong table in the middle. And I said, we need places to sit, to enjoy this room. And we're going to get rid of most of the bookcases. And I boxed up a whole lot of books, didn't get rid of them. But in moving the books and talking with my kids primarily about what we could box up and what we couldn't box up, we ended up creating in our crawl space a book nook. So a little reading room where you can sit was particularly comfortable if you were small, as they were at the time, but even now with foam padding on the floor and spaces where you can go into the crawl space. So we have one end of it is storage and one end of it is lined with short bookcases and is wall-to-wall books. So even we have created a hidden library within our house. And certainly, of course, we all socialize with people who are like us. But if you were to walk into, any of the homes that I would regularly visit before COVID, they aren't so different, right? We have our friends also have books that are, or houses that are overflowing with books, bookcases that are overflowing. And this is something, it's with the onset of being able to find things online is a little less common because I've simply added to the number of print books we have. I've now added way too many ebooks, but I don't think I could ever read all the ebooks that I have access to on my iPad, but I try. But some people, like now, looking at this text here, all of these texts, if you were to go into the Jewish Theological Seminary, into the library is a fraction of the size that it was when I went to seminary there, because most of these texts, instead of needing 27 versions of the Talmud so that people could pull out the physical book and learn together. They're all available online. And Sefaria is just one of the platforms that provide this type of text. So you can find Torah and Talmud and Mishnah and all sorts of Jewish texts right up until modernity in Sefaria. And let me see, this little 182 that's over here, that's notifications of new text have been added to Sefaria since I last went through my notifications. So all of these things are now more and more available online. And so you will find, I'm sure, that people will have fewer books in their homes, but they will still have access now that we have access to all of these texts and material digitally. So this first text, if you look at it, now I just went through that very, very quickly, but if it sounded at all familiar to you, or if you look at the English and it sounds familiar to you, this comes from the first paragraph of the Shema, right? We say the Shema and then we go on to the V'ahavta, you will love the Lord your God with all your soul and with all your might. And then we talk about how we should relate to God's word, right? We should teach these words, to our children. We should talk of them when we're in our homes, when we're out of our homes, doing whatever it is we do, when we go to bed, and when we rise up in the morning. So basically, the idea of teaching, specifically teaching, should happen pretty much all the time. And I don't think I included it. We'll see if it's there later on, but there is a piece in Pirkei Avot of the Ethics of the Fathers that says, I've learned much from my teachers, more from my friends, and even more from my students. And the idea of teaching also in Judaism is that it is a back and forth. I'm sure having a 3-year-old, that you experience learning new things every day, right? And one of the greatest things that I've experienced as a teacher is being able to share a text and then having someone, whether it's a kid, whether it's a teenager, a preteen, whoever, hello, coming and giving me some new way of thinking about a particular text that I haven't necessarily thought of because I've been used to learning it the same way over and over again, right? So this is our foundational text about why teaching and learning is so important in Judaism, right? This piece from the Shema, which we also recite 3 times a day. So reciting Shema 3 times a day, then we have this wonderful text that we say 3 times a day. This is how we should deal with teaching and learning, right? Later on, in the book of Deuteronomy, of Devarim, we get this particular mitzvah, this commandment. This is the second to last chapter of the Torah. The last chapter is a poem that Moshe recites. And it's all poetry. So this is the last real tachlis, this is what you have to do piece of the Torah, and this is towards the end of that chapter. So towards the end of the book of Devarim, towards the end of the Torah, it says you will write this song, a shirah, sometimes it's referred to as a poem, and you will teach it to the children of Israel, put it in their mouths, that this shirah, these words, this poem will be a witness for me, for God. And it doesn't mean, I don't really like the translation that's Faria uses here of against, but it should be Hashirah hazot le'ed. It really means as a witness for me, for Bivnei Yisrael, so but in the children of Israel, or on the children of Israel. Here they use the translation of against, but it's, I would say, a witness for me, for God, and for everything that we're supposed to do. So again, the idea of taking the words of the Torah or taking the lessons of the Torah and teaching it continuously, that it's something that you feed to your children, right? That you don't just tell it to them, like they should hear it in their ears. You put it in their mouths. And coming from this piece, there's a tradition that the first time a child learns any Jewish lesson, that the teachers would take a piece of paper and they would trace out Hebrew letters, like an aleph and a bet, and they would trace out in honey, and then the kids would be given it to lick off. Probably a better version of that today would be, giving kids cookies in the shapes of Hebrew letters. But the idea that even that very first taste of Hebrew, of Jewish learning that you should get, should be sweet in your mouths, right? And so we have this great idea that we don't just teach our kids, but we actually feed it to them. And so Jewish education is something that's supposed to be fed from a very early age. I'm gonna share the link to this text later, but I'm gonna jump down to this. Does this look familiar to anyone? Mm-hmm. So whenever I think of Jewish learning, I hear in my head the soundtrack from the original cast, which is the record, the old vinyl record, which is probably in my basement that my parents had, from Fiddler on the Roof, and about what everyone's role was, right? So, the fathers and the mothers, and then the sons and the daughters. And in both cases, they're taught things. Now, this is very gender-based. There's plenty in our traditional text that talks about teaching text that is gender-based, but there's also a fair amount that says essentially what good is a pretty face, talking about girls, what good is a pretty face if there's nothing inside, right? The idea that it's not enough for a girl to be pretty and to be able to do things, she should also be taught. Maybe the texts are not so strenuous about teaching girls as much as boys were taught, at least not the Talmud, but that girls also needed to be educated. And if you look through history, certainly in the more affluent areas where Jews lived, so like one example of that would be Italy. The Italian Jewish community was traditionally more affluent than, say, the Hungarian Jewish community or the Polish Jewish community. And there, girls went to school and were learned in text and Hebrew, not just Yiddish, not just whatever the Pidgin language was because Italy had its own version sort of Yiddish. There was Yiddish, but there was also a Judeo-Italian, not just in the local language or in the vernacular, but also in Hebrew. And they were taught to teach that, to learn that way. So jumping back up, this I think is really what we come down to, because when we talk about educating our children, it's not just schooling, right? The Shema just says these, you want to talk about these words. It's not just the pieces on how do you keep kosher or how do you build a house, or, in today we would say math or English or French or history. It's not just that, but teaching Jewishly. When we think of how to educate our children Jewishly, we're also talking about what does it mean to be a Jew, and therefore those things that we learn early on, that's the sort of thing that we'll take with us into old age. And I'm thinking in a different sort of way, if you think about people who later in life suffer from Alzheimer's, dementia, the things that they carry with them, the things that we never lose, are those pieces that we learn from early on in our lives. And especially things that we learn that had sensory pieces to them. So music or tastes will remind us of different things. So we're back to that first piece of Jewish learning, that we should be putting it in our children's mouths, right? So there's this way of educating Jewishly as parents. So this gives us, what are we obligated? What do we have to teach? You're a father, in this case, the Talmud is very specific. It is very gendered. It says you must teach your child Torah, and you must teach your child a trade. Right? So it's not enough to just say, oh, we're going to learn Torah, we're going to learn the Shema, we're going to learn some other text, maybe some Talmud, maybe some Hebrew, but you have to teach your child, so your child has a way to go. Looking back from this, a way to go. It's not enough to just learn Torah. Judaism has always said you must learn both Torah and secular studies. And our great rabbis were all trained in some sort of secular studies and also in Torah. I have a poster. I wish I had a picture of it. I didn't think of it until this very moment. But I have a poster that hangs in our sukkah every year. It was created, I have a version in English, but it was created for the Masorti movement in Israel, the conservative movement in Israel. And it was an ad that was put at bus stops in different places around the country. And it looks like an old page of the Yellow Pages. So anyone who remembers Yellow Pages, you know, if you need a carpenter, you could call this rabbi. If you needed a doctor, it was that rabbi. If you needed a shoemaker, it was this rabbi. And it goes through the sages from the Talmud and all the different roles that all the different occupations that they did. And the idea was that people shouldn't just be sitting in yeshiva, but that we have this idea in Talmud of im ein kemach, if there's no flour, ein Torah, there's no Torah. So if we don't have a way, a trade, a way of living, a way of earning money, a way of supporting ourselves, then we also can't be involved in Torah, because someone has to provide for a roof above our heads and food to eat and clothing to wear, and all of those needs that we have. And so a parent is obligated to teach both Torah, both the Jewish text and also a trade. And it goes on to say any father, the text itself says, just as any, or I guess, Ela Ki'ilu, really it's like he, just doesn't specifically say father, but he who does not teach his son a trade, his child a trade, then this is listut, banditry. This is thievery, right? Because it can't, that's the only thing that can enter your mind. If you're hungry, you don't have a trade and you can't support yourself, then of course you're going to be left with no other choice. So this is where I think Fiddler on the Roof gets that little piece. It's actually in our text. It doesn't say 3, but it says at 5, you know, when do you learn things? And it's going, this is a piece of text that's going through what you do at different ages. And it says at age 5, you learned Torah. Right here it says Mikra. So any scripture. At 10, Mishnah, so law, so first scripture, then law, then 13, the mitzvot, at 15, the Talmud, and of course, being a very different time from 2021, at 18, you went to the chuppah, right? But at 20, then once you went to the chuppah, you also needed to pursue your career. And then it goes on to say, of course, you reach your peak of strength at 40 wisdom, at 50 able to give counsel. So when do you start teaching? When would you start offering counsel? And then it gives for 100. And we have this idea actually in Judaism that a full life is actually 80. At 83, you can celebrate a second bar mitzvah if you'd like. It's considered a second, you've had a second life in a way. And a wonderful greeting for someone's birthday, although I imagine as people live longer and longer, it's less of a good greeting, is Ad Mea V'Esrim, which means until 120. So if someone should live to be 120, that is considered the longest possible life.
It's 83, you get the second bar mitzvah? 83?
It should be at 70. So yes, so we're here at 70. Whoops, that didn't do what I wanted to. Oh, you're not going to let me just click. Okay. There we go. At 70 is a fullness of years, so it takes 70 and then add 13.
Uh,
For women, is it like 82? Like, or 83? Like 12 versus 13?
Should be 82 for women.
Oh yeah.
I have only seen a couple of these B'nai Mitzvah in my life. I have actually been to a couple. They have all been men, and I haven't really met women who at 82 or 83 were seeking to celebrate another bat mitzvah, which may also come from the fact that many women who would be reaching that age didn't have the opportunity to actually celebrate a bat mitzvah because that wasn't so common when they were turning 12 or 13. And so for them, many of them celebrated as adults anyway. So they're not seeking to celebrate the same way. But yeah, it would be, there's no reason why it wouldn't be 82 for women. So
For the one you attended, did they throw candies at the 83-year-old?
yes, but only soft candy and only very.
Yeah. All right, thank you.
we need to find a way to celebrate this with someone turning
Yeah.
83.
You have to find the 83-year-old.
And then just throw candy at them, whoever they are. Just
It's a mitzvah.
They're gonna be just wondering, why are people throwing things at me?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a mitzvah.
It's a mitzvah.
That's all I need to know.
There you go. So we're going to get into some talkless, some real material. What does it mean to educate, and how do we do that? So I want to start with this text, and then we're going to talk about day school versus Hebrew school versus other stuff. So this is a great text. Every educator, Jewish educator I know, loves this text. This is when Sarah says to Abraham, I don't want Hagar and that child, her son. She never calls Ishmael by name. It's always that boy in my house anymore, and you should send him out. And God says, Abraham goes to God to ask for counsel, and God says you should listen to your wife. So Hagar and Ishmael go out into the desert, the wilderness. It's not so much desert as much as wilderness. And at some point, Hagar has used up the water she has and the food, and she, concerned for her child, puts Ishmael down and walks away because the commentary says she didn't want to watch him suffer and die. She couldn't, as a parent, do that. So this was the best thing she could think of. And then in the text it says that God heard the voice of the Na'ar, and a Na'ar isn't a baby; it's a probably an adolescent, and an angel called out to Hagar from heaven and said to her, Malach Hagar, what's going on with you? And says, don't worry. God has heard the voice of the Na'ar, meaning Ishmael, Ba'asher Husham, where he is. And this could be interpreted very literally. Just, this is the needs of Ishmael. They were out in the wilderness. They had nothing. That was it. But this particular text, Ba'asher Husham, specifically those last three words in Hebrew or in English, where he is, have been taken by our sages from pretty much from the moment people started commenting on Torah until modernity. And Ba'asher Husham means you have to meet the child where the child is. So this is the ideal of Jewish education. And part of it is, some of the commentaries ask, there's going to be all this strife between Ishmael or the children of Ishmael and the children of Isaac, and how are we supposed to deal with that? And wouldn't it have been better if God didn't do anything and just left them? And the answer is absolutely not, that everyone has potential as long as we meet them where they are. And so whoever that person is, we need to meet every individual where they are, and we need to educate them according to who they are and where they are in that moment. And so that becomes very important, because that means that there are things that you teach. You know, looking back at that text, you know, at five Mikra, which is Tanakh, Torah and prophets and the writings, you know, and then Mishnah, and then Talmud, and going through at different ages. The idea there comes from here, which is that people are prepared to understand things at different ages. Right? We just had Pesach. I think Pesach is one of the most brilliant educational moments when it's done right. And it's not always so easy to do right. I think the best we ever did was when we were in New York, and we had a lot of family around us. And of course, some of them wanted to eat early, some of them wanted to leave early, some of them just wanted to be part of the Seder, some of them wanted to do the whole Seder. We had a lot of little kids around. Karen was an infant. Jesse had just begun school, so he was a kindergartner. Gavi was a toddler. You know, so we had some cousins who were slightly older than our kids. So we had this range of ages from 1 year to somewhere in their 70s, with all sorts of backgrounds. One of my mother-in-law's cousins always comes to Seder, but is a Mormon, like totally different attitude, right? So, you know, we have this very interesting range of people. And 1 year we got smart. It was probably the last year we were in New York, and we sent out a note giving everyone information about Seder. This is what time we're starting. This is what time we expect to be eating. We as a family, we actually eat from Karpas on. So if you had tuned in, Mariana, last month to talk about Pesach, one of the things I tell people is start eating early. Don't wait for the meal to eat, but when we do the list of things you can do for Seder, we start with Kadesh, so you say Kiddush, and then we wash our hands, Kadesh, or Chatz, Karpas. Karpas is number 3. Once you've said that blessing, you can eat anything that has that blessing. And so we said, we promise there will be food, there will be lots and lots of food. It will all be vegetarian. But our table is filled with food. We also told people, if it gets to be too late, we do not know what time Seder will end. If it gets to be too late, please do not feel awkward if you feel you need to leave. We will be continuing at whatever pace we take. And so it happened that Sean's aunt and uncle got up at some point and said, thank you. It was great to see everyone. It's getting a little late. We're going to go. And we all said, have a great night, drive safely. And that was it. Chag Sameach. And they left, and it was quiet, and there were no hard feelings, and no one wondered how much longer, how many more pages, there was none of that. And we don't always do it. I don't know why I didn't continue it wherever we've been. I probably should. But the idea was I wanted each person to get whatever he or she or they needed from that Seder, and then they could go. And the Seder itself, if you think about it, we use all of our senses. So there's taste, there's the scent of the wine, there's the scent from the charoset. Some people have a tradition of putting flowers on the table. There are all of the different foods. If you have really good maror, if you have really good strong horseradish, you have the scent of that also. You have the visual, you have singing, you have pages to read, you have pictures in the Haggadot that you use. So we have all of the different modes of learning built into this one ritual, so that hopefully someone can take whatever they need from that ritual and they can learn from that piece. If we could manage to do all of our lessons with song and taste and smell and visual aids, it would be so much better. Like as a teacher, when I have the opportunity to teach in the classroom, I always have some form of visual aid, whether it's a handout, a video, something I can put up on the wall, whatever it is, there will always be something. And the great thing about handouts is then people also have something talkless to touch. So if you're a little distracted, so you read ahead, you can doodle on it, you can do whatever. It helps people as a child to learn, as a child who couldn't sit still. For myself, as a kid who doodled in every margin of every book I ever had, to be able to provide that for someone and not find fault with it so that they can learn from wherever they are is a really important piece, in my opinion. So getting into this, I think when we think about educating our kids, the question isn't just what do we teach them, or, because we expect that our text is going to say we teach them text, but rather how do we go about doing that? And I found this great quote. It's actually two quotes from two different people in an article. There's the article, The Pros and Cons of a Day School Education. And I find it very funny because it's similar to stuff that I've said about my children's day school education. One good thing about Solomon Schechter High School, and here they were talking about a particular high school called Solomon Schechter High School. Robbins Hebrew Academy here in Toronto is a Solomon Schechter school. It's part of the conservative movement. One good thing about the Solomon Schechter High School is all the kids there are Jewish. One bad thing about Solomon Schechter High School is that all the kids there are Jewish. So I am a product of public school, and not just public school in general. I lived in a town on Long Island that was very Jewish, probably split evenly almost between Jewish and Italians, with some Irish thrown in and some random other people. But where my parents chose to live was pretty much evenly split. So if you went to the south, it was predominantly Jewish. If you went north of where we lived, it was predominantly Italian. If you went west of where we lived, it was very, very Irish. Where we lived had this interesting mix of people, and the line for the high school came down just beyond our neighbor's house. So that divided up in such a way that the mix of people went to one high school. I went with the Irish and Italian kids to another high school, and then there was a third high school that covered the south of the town. It was actually two smaller towns that had a shared junior high and high school, middle school and high school system. So I went to a school that was predominantly Christian, mostly Catholic. And I went as a kid who sometime in my, I guess, grade 10 year, decided I was going to become a more observant Jew. My family was conservative, but we were probably what was typical for most conservative families, in that we marked all the holidays. We became more observant around the time I was 10, 11, and that we started doing Shabbat dinner every week. But we weren't an observant family in that we didn't fully observe Shabbat. We didn't fully observe the Chagim. I think Passover was the only time during the year where we absolutely kept kosher. But as we started becoming more observant, Friday night was sacred. You could do whatever you wanted after dinner, with go out with friends or whatever, but Friday night you were expected to be at the Shabbat table with the family, and I could invite anyone I want. So our Shabbat meals were often multi-faith and even multicultural. So, because my parents encouraged that. I benefited tremendously in that my parents encouraged that, which meant I had a wonderful multicultural group of friends. So I had friends who were Catholics and friends who were Christians, and I learned early on that not all Christians, the Catholics are not considered Christian by many Christians, even though by Jews, they're considered, we generally lump them together as they're all Christian. But to Christians, Catholics are not Christian, Catholics are Catholic. I had friends who were Hindu. I did not have any friends who were Muslim. I had friends from Korea and India, and whose parents moved from Germany. All of my friends were born in the US, but their parents were born in Korea and India and Germany, many in the United States, and grandparents born in Italy and Spain. And among the Jewish community, parents or grandparents or great-grandparents born in most of the Eastern European countries, and a few friends who were Jewish and Sephardi, even though I would say the area was primarily Ashkenaz. Right? So I have this amazing multicultural group of friends. And frequently, I would say the one thing that comes up in talking about my kids' day school education, and I'm very happy that they went through the day school system here. You know, I can't say I have any more complaints here than with day school than I would have with any school, public or private, anywhere. My only complaint is I had this amazing multicultural group of friends, and my children did not have that benefit. Now, would they have that if they went to public school? I don't know. I got lucky and I went to this particular, the way the districting went, I went to this particular high school and ended up with this group of friends. When we first moved to Toronto and Jesse began day school, our oldest, and then actually even when Gabi and Karen began school, we were living down in Cedarvale. The kids they would have gone to school with would have all been Jewish. They just would have been in public school. But the makeup of their classes would not have been at that time significantly different. And in fact, in some ways, though the kids were all Jewish, their schooling was a little more multicultural at the day school than it might have been. Just happens to be because of who was going to school at that time. I wouldn't say that's necessarily true for day school all the time. But there's a value in this is how I live my life. So when you talk about things like Sukkot, everyone gets it. Whether they observe it or not, they get it. When Jesse was first starting, when he would been in what was JK here, we were in North Carolina, and he was doing nursery in North Carolina, and he was in public school. And he was one of 3 Jewish children in the entire school. And so his class, he had great teachers and there were no issues, but when it came time for American Thanksgiving and then December, a time when most families put up their Christmas trees, the discussions just amongst the students, did you put your tree up? What kind of tree do you have? Do you have a live tree? What kind of decorations do you do? Jesse it's not that he felt left out, simply couldn't understand. And he came home one day as a kindergartner, so a JK student, and said, are they going to force me to celebrate Christmas? Now, it wasn't coming from the teachers. It certainly wasn't coming from the curriculum, and it wasn't coming from any animosity. It was just coming from children being very excited about Christmas, as they should be. Right? Of course they should be. I have the other story I want to tell is I have this great story comes from one of my classmates, Rabbi Dan Wolpe. It's actually about his brother, one of his brothers, and one of his sisters-in-law. And one of his sisters-in-law happens to be a convert to Judaism. And when their youngest, I guess, was starting to notice all of the Christmas lights in their neighborhood, she said, the daughter looked at them and was like, ooh, I love all the pretty lights. And her mother turned to her and said, they're not pretty. And Dan's brother turned and said, of course they're pretty. They're not ours, but they're pretty. And, this was one of those situations where, here was a kid who had gone to nursery school at the local synagogue, and was only just being exposed to this, and we can react. The reaction was immediately to reject it. Now, I think part of it was she was concerned about her daughter feeling like she was missing out on something. But I have a friend who's Presbyterian, and we were talking, and he only just took down his Christmas lights last week. The weather turned warm. He finally took down his Christmas lights, which is later than he normally does. And he was saying, I finally took them down, and now I miss them. And I think part of it is just with COVID and everything else. So I'm thinking of putting up Easter lights. I just right, this is like 3 days before Easter. And I said, look, as someone who doesn't have to put up the lights or take down the lights, I can tell you there are still lights up in our neighborhood, and I enjoy them. And they're just one more nice thing to see when we're walking around the same neighborhood over and over and over. And so, the ability to appreciate them while understanding that they're not yours. So when all of the kids are Jewish and you can appreciate the holidays that people don't normally know about, Sukkot, Shmini Atzeret, Simchat Torah, Hanukkah, everyone knows, and it gets overdone. But Tu B'Shvat and Purim and Shavuot. So Passover, most Jewish families do. Hanukkah, most Jewish families do. The high holidays, most Jewish families do. But all of these other little ones, right? If they can be experienced without anyone saying, well, that's weird. That's not a bad thing. Of course, depending on the day school, they may or may not be observing the same way your family is observing. So you have this balance of all the kids are Jewish, but all the kids are Jewish. How do we decide which way we want to go? Again, I'm a product of public school and Hebrew school. I know I should say Hebrew school is great as a rabbi. Hebrew school has come a really long way, but for students to have to go to public school all week and then continue with Hebrew studies, it gets tiring, and it's one more thing added into their schedules. And that, I will say, had more to do, I think, with my decision and my husband, the decision we made to send our kids to day school. That yes, it's a long day, but it's one day, and when they're done, they go on and they get both at the same time. They also get Hebrew. They also get Talmud in a way that, even though Sean and I are both rabbis, we were never going to be able to pass on to our children in the way that studying in school could do that. But as parents, the things we can do are, educating that by having, like Mario, you said you're doing Shabbat every week now, right? Your son, was it?
Yep.
Okay, I'm remembering correctly. Your son really loves it, right? To be able to take time educating Jewishly, it's not just about what school did they go to. I'm gonna stop the share now. What school did they go to? Did we decide Hebrew school? Did we decide day school? Did we decide Hebrew tutors or Jewish tutors that might give them specific pieces, which I know some people do? It's really about, as parents, what can we pass on to our children? What can we provide to our children? And how do we value everything? If the other piece of Jewish education, actually, before I go into the other pieces of Jewish education that we have in the Jewish community are youth groups and summer camp. And I will say, as someone who has focused on a lot of Jewish sociology, I believe that those pieces, as great as day school is, not, I don't want to, my colleagues who love day school will probably not love that I say this, but as great as day school is, I think that summer camp is more important and youth group is more important, because then this is learning about Judaism, experiencing Judaism with peers. Summer camp is living Judaism, especially overnight summer camp, is living Judaism every day for an extended period of time, whether it's 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, whatever that period of time is. But of course, you need to be a certain age to do that. Youth group allows children to experiment and seek out and debate Judaism with a peer group. And that also is very important. One of those texts I started with, which isn't in the source sheet, but I said is, I have learned much from my teachers, more from my friends, and the most from my students. And the idea that youth groups give youth themselves the opportunity to become teachers, but also that they can debate Judaism on a peer-to-peer level through the use of pop culture or whatever they're thinking about. And when I was USY director, we did a whole program on reality TV, like the good and the bad and what Jewish values they do or do not have, right? And you can look at what the kids are doing and then talk about it Jewishly. When I was in rabbinical school, my very first year, actually year 0, our prep year, Star Trek was on Next Generation. Star Trek, so don't date myself, Star Trek Next Generation was on the night before we had rabbinical school seminar. We would come in the next morning, and before class started, as we gathered, the first conversation was, what was Jewish in Star Trek last night? That was every class started that way. We met once a week, every class started that way, but not with the teacher, just amongst the peer group. And we were first year rabbinical students. We were almost all of us in our early 20s, right? So those are the people who are leading the youth groups, who are teaching at summer camps. There are some people like me who are older and have degrees in Jewish ed, but mostly they're learning from people who aren't the people they see as Jewish educators. And so if they could see people living Jewish lives, that's a really important value. Although the most important person to see living a Jewish life, of course, are parents, and what you choose to do at home and what you choose to make fun is what's really important. Because if we can do that, goes back to, if we give them this important information when they're young, they'll carry it with them. I always say Judaism education, Jewish education and Judaism should be about what can we do, not what can't we do. So you can say when teaching Shabbat, well, you can't watch television, you can't, I don't know, light a fire in the fireplace, and you can't use your computer, or you can't do this. Or we can say we can be together as a family and we can have a discussion. Or in my house right now and through the entire pandemic has been, we can do another puzzle. I've lost track of how many puzzles we have done. There's one mostly done on my dining room table right now, and when it's done, there will be another one done. There are 2 completed puzzles and a 3rd one in process on the table right now. I don't know how many we've given away and how many more that's what we've been doing. And as I mentioned earlier, my kids are just about 19, 20, and 24. And they still want to sit down and do a puzzle with us, and still want to, most of the time, sit at the dinner table with us. And that comes from being willing to listen to them and realize that we learn as much from them as we teach them. And also that Jewish education, if we realize that Jewish education is not just about, did they learn the Shema, but also about, did they learn Jewish ethics? Did they learn values and derech eretz, manners and how we're supposed to act? When people ask if someone's observant, they usually mean, do they observe Shabbat? Do they observe holidays? Do they observe kashrut? But the other questions are, do they observe the mitzvah of tzedakah? Do they observe the mitzvah of greeting everybody with a happy face, right? Which comes up in Pirkei Avot, that you should greet everyone with a pleasant and a happy face. Do they observe the mitzvah of honoring their elders, of respecting people, of caring for the sick? All of those are mitzvot, and none of those are any less important than Shabbat and holidays and kashrut and all of the other ones that we think of when we think of how do we educate our children Jewishly and what do we really talk about. And, you know, again, back to that, you know, I grew the secular schooling that I got. I was raised, my father was a socialist Zionist. So in many ways, he grew up anti-Jewish religiously. So along with, I mean, I was raised in the US, so there's a very strong folk song culture in the US that isn't as present here in Canada. But along with the Shema, the words of the Shema, probably around the same time, I learned the words to Woody Guthrie's "You Can't Scare Me, I'm Sticking with the Union," right? Supporting unions, work unions, and all sorts of labor unions, and why this was important, right? So that was the stuff that was put into my mouth, going back to where I started, put into my mouth as a child, and it stuck with me, right? The value system of how do we educate our children Jewishly is really about the values and awareness of those values. Because if we send our kids to day school, we also have hidden messages. So one of my teachers, that one who taught that rabbinical school seminar, that first rabbinical school seminar where we talked about Star Trek, Rabbi Eddie Feinstein, he taught us that everything has a hidden message. So if you send your kids to Jewish camp and they live Jewishly during the summer, but they don't live Jewishly the rest of the year at all, and there are plenty of people who do that. They don't necessarily have Shabbat dinner or light candles or do anything during the year, but their kids go Jewish summer camp. They learn that Judaism is what you do on your downtime, on your vacation time during the summers. If we send our kids to day school, they can learn that Judaism is something that is for the classroom, but not for the home. If we send our kids to youth group, Judaism is something that maybe I do with my friends for fun, but it's not something I do in my everyday life. Right? If we send our kids to Hebrew school, it can be Judaism is what I do for the after hours, the in-between. But if we combine all of these pieces together, and most importantly, our home life, and we realize that we're our children's first teachers, and whatever decisions we make in the future, we're not just the first, but the most important teachers our children are going to have in their lives. And we can live some of that ethical Judaism and along with the lighting candles and having Shabbat dinner and finding observance and marking the holidays wherever we are, so that they will be proud of those holidays. So we won't have to worry about them looking at Christmas lights and thinking, oh, aren't those pretty? Because yes, they are. They're lovely and pretty, and go out and find the street in Toronto that has the most Christmas lights ever and go check it out every year. Or go, when travel is safe, go down to Times Square and Fifth Avenue in New York City and Rockefeller Center and see the giant Christmas tree and walk and see all of the Christmas windows. And I highly recommend that, although it's gotten incredibly crowded over the years, because it's fun and it's beautiful, you know, and enjoy that and enjoy the Christmas carols that are being played because they're pretty, but then also enjoy Sukkot and enjoy Hanukkah in its own right, not as something that's opposite Christmas, and enjoy Tu B'Shvat in any way possible. I will say one of the things I did that I wish I can't quite say I regret it, but wish I hadn't quite done it, was when my kids went to day school and they started doing all the holidays in school, we stopped doing things like planting parsley at Tu B'Shvat to have it Seder. Right? We stopped doing some of the things at home because they were doing it in school. Now we still observed all the holidays, but we've skipped some of those things, right? If you can bring those things into your children's lives, then that's educating your children Jewishly, and that's giving them a complete and whole education rather than just a piecemeal one. All right, I'm going to stop there because we've gone a little past 9 o'clock. And Chloe and I will talk about, I know there are other people who want to come about doing like an addendum to this with other types of Jewish parenting stuff and education, maybe in a couple of weeks. But are there any questions?
Yeah.
Very inspiring.
So now I'm just very dry from talking for now.
I don't think so. No, I've heard the same thing too, that the camps is like from friends, like that's where they had the most impactful like Jewish element on their lives. It seems to be like a common thing.
So you get it both, like you said, you've heard from friends, you get it in that anecdotal report. But
Yeah.
so we also see it in studies that are done, which show like children, well now adults, who observe holidays or keep kosher or join a synagogue or connected to the Jewish community, you know, what's a common thread? And camp is one of the most common
Yeah.
threads.
Yeah. It seems like where you can get the best bang for your buck. Like if you can do one or the other, it seems like camps.
And it's
Yeah.
it's expensive. There's no
Yeah.
denying that, right? So if you have to choose, I say, you know, choose camp. If you can't do camp, and even if you can do camp, Jewish youth group, right? Jewish youth.
I've
group,
never heard of Jewish youth group.
I did like Torah High and NCSY.
there-
Well, you always talk about this. Do you know if this exists still? The like Jewish scouts?
yes, definitely still exists.
Because Leah would love that, but I tried to Google it and we couldn't like find it or anything, right?
So it
No.
still exists. I
Yeah.
don't know if it's under the same name, but Rabbi Wernick might be able to find it, or I can try. I'll try and look.
Oh yeah, I can ask him. Oh, you know what? I'll ask the
The Shinshin.
new Sherelle, the
Right.
Sherelle
You didn't ask.
while she's on mat leave. We call her new Sherelle. Temporary Sherelle.
The temporary Sherelle.
Yeah.
Yeah, she should be able to, if she doesn't know off the top of her head, to find out.
Yeah.
But like, the conservative one that would be at Tzedek, is USY, Demon USY, but it doesn't start. Unfortunately, most of these groups don't start until middle school. Right. So,
Yeah.
you know, before
That's
that,
why I thought the scout things, maybe they'd be even like preschool. I
right.
don't know.
No, it wasn't that. Yeah.
No, I don't know. Scouts is usually, isn't
I don't
it?
know.
I don't know that goes quite that early, but there have been Jewish Boy Scout and Girl Scout groups, you know, within Boy Scouts and Girl Guides, there have been Jewish groups. So you just have to see if there's
Yeah.
one based at a synagogue or a Jewish group around where you are, and see if there is that, because that gives you, it also gives you people who are Jewish, but not necessarily the same as you, which is also really good.
Mariana, were you still thinking RHA? And that was in your thought at one point.
Yeah, actually, he'll start nursery school for half days in September. Like, who knows how.
At RHA?
Mhm.
Whoa.
My kids did RHA.
Yeah.
We moved to Toronto when Jesse was going into grade 3, so he started then. But our
Yeah.
youngest started, our younger son started in SK, and our daughter started in JK. And before that, she was
So-
like JCC for daycare. So they did
Yeah.
it all the way, and now they've all gone off to university. And Jesse's actually a graduate, and they're involved in their own different ways and they have, and that the problematic, all the kids in day school are Jewish. They went off to university and they found plenty of friends who are Jewish and not, and they have a good foundation. I would like to assume that they'd have a good foundation even if they hadn't gone to day school, but they have a good foundation.
Well, having 2 rabbi parents probably helps.
Yeah, it makes you a little weird.
Yeah.
They get the question, is it weird to have 2 rabbi parents? And they've said, the answer is usually, I don't know. I've always had 2 rabbi parents, so I can't really answer that.
Yeah. Mariana, just FYI, so we took Leo out of RHA, not because we didn't love RHA. It's a super long story. It's more just his learning style that we've learned about through COVID and having a teacher for him this year. So we're going to be at the Jewish Montessori next year. That's the goal. I mean, if it's a normal year. Yeah.
Here, God willing, it should be.
Yeah.
Also,
Yeah.
you know what? One of the great things we have in Toronto, and we sort of joked around about it when we first moved here, was Toronto has so many different Jewish schools. So
Really are.
there's a Montessori school, and there's the Heschel school, which is a little more arts based, and there's there's the religious Zionist school, and there are the more ultra orthodox schools, and then there's the community schools, and there's each of the movements has a school, and Bialik, which is Zionist but not religious Zionist, more secular Zionist school, and you have all of these choices.
Yeah.
And that's also with Jewish summer camp. I always tell people with Jewish summer camp, my kids went to Ramah. I went to day camp. I eventually worked at Ramah. Ramah fits our hashkafa, our way of thinking, right? It's conservative. It's the conservative movement camp. It made sense. And our kids had a wonderful experience and loved it. Ramah, they went right through Ramah, Canada, and would have it no other way. But I also know, I also have friends here whose kids went to the Ramah in Colorado, which is a real camping program. It was based on the Ramah tripping program at Ramah, Canada. It's out in the Colorado mountains. It's camping out. It's a very different style of overnight camp. It's not go to camp and you have all of the same activities, swimming and tennis and whatever, and you sleep in cabins. This is, you go out on week-long trips, and there's a farm you can work at. There's a Ramah Sports Academy. There's the Ramah Northern California is good for the kids in that region, or I think they do marine biology and surfing and I don't know, acting. Like they have, the Ramahs now are besides the regional camps, are focused on different activities. So, find the right place for your kid. And if the right place isn't the place you start with, they'll adjust if you switch them.
Which makes me think, when you're talking about camp, Henry basically every summer went to a different Jewish camp. Like he didn't stick to, he just went every year, something different. And it seems to be what I'm doing with Leo now. Every year of his school, we put him in a different school.
You know what?
Which,
and
yeah.
he will adjust, and he will do fine because he'll be used to making new friends and doing that. And it's not such a bad thing. Jesse, just because Sean was still in the military, and then we got out of the military, then we moved up here. So my husband was in the US Navy. All right, I don't think you've heard that from me before. He lived in, wait a minute, 1, 2, 3, 4. Wait, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Oh, that does.
5, 6.
Guys, I'm going to sign it. Ezra just woke up, so
Okay.
I probably won't make it back.
Bye, Chloe.
And then 6 houses before he was 8 years old. And and it turns out, we didn't know this then, but we know now, that he's also borderline autistic. And you would think moving from place to place to place like that would have been awful, but actually it made him very flexible because he got used to it. So it's not something I would recommend for anyone, not a kid, not an adult, whatever. It happened to be, he was born at a time when we ended up moving around like this. But kids are amazingly resilient, and they're like sponges, and they can make us crazy because of that, but they're also great. And so the most important thing about educating kids is to have fun with it. I'm gonna just end with that to say, wherever your kid is, do whatever's right for your kid and what works for you as a parent, or the two of you as parents. That's really what it comes down to. If you have strong Jewish values and you share them and you live them, then your kids are going to have that too. And if you have any questions, always be willing, have someone you can always ask. Have a rabbi, have a friend, someone, have a teacher you can go to, and be comfortable enough also saying, I don't know, I'm gonna find that out. Or we used to do it this way, but I learned this and we're gonna try this now. Right? So that you can do what's right for yourself, so that you're always learning. Because also if you're always learning, then your kids are gonna see that learning isn't always important, not just something that you do when you're little and then you just stop. Right? We all tend to, there are certain things that we just stop when we reach adulthood, and that when we have the opportunity to go back and learn more, it's like, oh, right, I never realized that. That's what learning from our kids is so important as well.
That's fun.
Have a good time.
Thank you so
If,
much.
if there are no other questions, I'm gonna end the meeting, and it was good to see you this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Stay well.
This was excellent. Thank you.
Get your vaccine soon.
Bye. Bye, Henry.
Be well. Bye.
Night.